Why might I, sir? We've never used them before.
Pre-, mid-, and post-tribulation rapture states that every Christian, all Christians alive or dead, will be raptured on the same day, but at different points along the timeline of the Great Tribulation, a biblically prophesied event set to occur in the 7 years prior to the battle at Armageddon in Jesus' millennial reign. Suddenly and without warning, all Christians alive and dead are taken up in the blink of an eye to meet Jesus in the sky, while the wicked are left behind to remain on this planet as it erupts in cosmic turmoil. Depending on one's view, Christians are out of here before it all hits the fan. For pre-tribbers, Christians are taken out before all of it and will return with Jesus as his righteous army to fight at Armageddon. Mid-tribbers see Christians facing at least half of the tribulation, then will be raptured moments before Jesus' return with his angel army to fight the battle. Great earthquakes, tsunamis, astronomical events, political turmoil, and global warfare are what those left behind will have to endure. Post-tribbers expect Christians to endure the tribulation in its entirety, being removed prior to the wrath, of which devastation will be at a scale that puts Satan's destructive efforts to shame. Jesus returns with his angel army to fight the battle at Armageddon. What they all have in common is that Christians alive and dead are gathered at once prior to the battle at Armageddon and will co-rule and reign with Jesus until the Last Judgment. But which of these positions is correct? Has there always been differing perspectives within the Church? If not, which one is the orthodox view? Alternative rapture theories first began in the late 16th century. The Bible was being translated from Latin and Greek into native languages, and the invention of the Gutenberg printing press in 1455 made the Bible accessible to many more readers. Translation, printing, and increased literacy among the populace enabled everyday people to read and study the Bible for themselves for the first time. Learning and thinking for themselves, people were no longer limited to hearing the official positions told to them by church authorities. Conflicts would arise, many of which were expressed in the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church had been selling indulgences among other deeply troubling behaviors, which motivated the Reformers' call to action. Reformers' interpretations were developed as doctrines completely at odds with the official position of the Catholic Church. The Church was also a ruling body. Going against the Church was equivalent to overthrowing a deeply established government system, corruption notwithstanding. The threat to the ecclesiastical powers that be was very real. The motivations of the Reformers were grounded mainly in the Church's abuses of power, not so much their core traditional doctrinal views. It was these abuses that led the Reformers to associate the Catholic Church as a present-day beast system and the papacy as the Antichrist of Revelation, an interpretation that would hold sway for 1,260 years. The Catholic Church tried to censor the printing press and silence preachers, all to no avail, so a new approach had to be found to take the heat off the Church. Up to this time, the method of interpreting biblical prophetic events was one of historicism. By associating symbols with historical persons, nations, and events, it gives a continuous fulfillment of prophecy from biblical times through to the second coming of Christ. Almost all of the Protestant reformers held historical views, and using that logic in light of the present situation, identified the Roman Catholic Church as the persecuting apostasy and the Pope as the Antichrist. The Roman Church struck back in a counter-reformation and commissioned Jesuit priests to strategize alternative methods of interpreting prophecy using exegetic strategies like preterism and futurism. Preterism, in other words, all prophecy was already fulfilled in the past, and futurism, or prophecy is yet to be fulfilled in the future, both of these positions perfectly disputed that the papacy was the Antichrist, since the prophecies had either already been fulfilled or hadn't yet been fulfilled. While this got the Pope off the hook as the Antichrist, it created as many problems as it solved. The Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, comprised of a commission of cardinals, was gathered together for the purpose of tidying up the problematic issues with the Catholic Church, as well as to strategize a plan to re-emerge as the dominant and only true Church of God. Pivotal to this movement was the establishment of new religious orders. The most well-known of these religious orders created at this time, and the one that evolved into the largest in the world, was the Society of Jesus, or Societas Iesu, otherwise known as the Jesuits. The Jesuit order served under the Pope as missionaries and were bound by a vow of special obedience to the sovereign pontiff in regard to the missions. These men were not chanting monks on a mountain in some distant monastery. They were an ideological and political army, militant in their structure and at the Pope's service at the time of the Counter-Reformation. The founder of the Jesuits was a Spanish Basque priest and theologian named Don Inigo Lopez, and later, after he changed his name, Ignatius of Loyola. He was born into an exceedingly wealthy family in the Basque region of Spain in 1491. As a young man, Ignatius had a great love for the military. He fashioned his life around famous military stories like Knights of Camelot and harbored an immense desire for his own fame. He joined the army at 17 and, according to one biographer, strutted proudly about with his cape slinging open to reveal his tight-fitting hose and boots, a sword and dagger at his waist. He was known to be a womanizer, an expert dancer, and dressed in the finest clothes. Police records say he was sensitive to insult, proud and violent, vindictive and dangerous. When arrested, he used his status and privilege to escape prosecution for violent crimes. Basically, the man was a textbook malignant narcissist, but perhaps that is a topic best left for another time. His greatest ambition was to become a powerful military commander, which was transpiring nicely until a cannonball broke one of his legs and severely wounded the other during a battle which eventually left him a cripple. It was this that ended his military career. He was removed from the field of battle, underwent several surgical operations, and spent a lengthy time in recovery. It is said that during this time Ignatius had a nervous breakdown at this turn of events that brought his military ambitions and life's dreams to a very abrupt end. During the long period in his recovery bed, Ignatius began consuming fantastical religious texts of the works of the Catholic saints. He wanted to become a saint and modeled himself after saints like Assisi and others. Ignatius envisioned Jesus as a great military commander, and while Ignatius' own military career was over, he could instead become a sort of general in Jesus' army with one goal in mind: to conquer the entire world. Ignatius made his way across Spain to a Benedictine monastery located in the Montserrat Mountains. Within this monastery was a venerated idol of the Black Madonna, of which Pope Leo XIII would later grant the statue canonical coronation in 1881. Otherwise known as Our Lady of Montserrat, this highly venerated statue represents the Assyrian and Babylonian goddess, or Queen of Heaven, Ishtar, sometimes called Ashtoreth or Astarte, of which the Catholic Church had commandeered this idol and associated it with Mary, Jesus' mother. It was this goddess that is mentioned in the Bible 2 times, both in the book of Jeremiah. The Israelites provoked the Lord to anger by raising altars and offering sacrifices to this idol, thought to be the wife of the false god Baal, otherwise known as Molech. Ignatius held vigil, kneeling before this idol continuously for 3 days and nights, where he pledged his work to her, and by doing so, committed himself to the demonic goddess Ishtar. He wanted to travel to conquer and convert Muslims in Jerusalem, and even though he was ridiculously wealthy, refused to use his own money but instead wanted to beg his way there, as real, actual poor saints had done in centuries past. He was unable to make the trip as the plague had taken Barcelona, forcing him to remain for almost a year in Manresa. During that time, he had taken up residence inside a cave, denying and torturing himself in penitence until he began to see visions. Ignatius claimed that through these visions, the secret doctrine of the Catholic Church was taught to him by a form in the air near him. This form gave him much consolation because it was exceedingly beautiful. It was the shape of a serpent and had many things that shone like eyes but were not eyes. He received much delight and consolation from gazing upon this object, but when the object vanished, he became utterly inconsolable. It is interesting that this seemingly demonic cave revelation runs parallel to the cave vision brought to the prophet Muhammad, who saw the appearance of an angel who claimed to be Gabriel. Both Ignatius and Muhammad were prone to major depressive states after contact with these entities in their absence. Shortly after this, Ignatius began formal theological study at various universities, as his preaching without formal education became problematic to the church. During his studies, he and a group of his companions set out to make disciples. While he preached, it is said that some followers became inflamed in hysteria, falling senseless, another sometimes rolled about on the ground, another in the grip of convulsions or shuddering, sweating in anguish. From this point forward, Ignatius was known as having mystical powers, even being jailed under suspicion of being a member of the Alumbrado, otherwise known as the Illuminati. In 1534, Ignatius had garnered 6 loyal colleagues that he had met during his time at university. It was this group, along with Ignatius, who formed the Society of Jesus, a military brotherhood. They had taken solemn vows, committing themselves to lifelong work for this cause, and modeling themselves with a military-like structure that Ignatius had learned from his military training and experience. Ignatius was appointed by the Church the first superior general of the order. They began the mission of opposing the Reformation and re-establishing the dominance of the Roman Church in Europe and around the world. They traveled to Rome, whom at the time was under Pope Paul III. This pope accepted the Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits, recognizing what he deemed a necessity for a military power to gain global victory over the Reformation or any alternate form of Christianity for that matter. This was a move of force by any means necessary to bring the Church back to its position of dominance. Francisco Ribera, an early Jesuit priest under Ignatius, was one of the first futurists. Keeping fresh in your mind that the Jesuits' sole mission was to counter the teachings of the Reformers and to bring the Church back into dominance. His 500-page work was later picked up by a Chilean Jesuit priest, Manuel Lacunza, who wrote a 3-volume work called The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty under the Jewish pseudonym Juan ben Ezra. In it, he developed a number of new ideas, some of which directly relate to our pre-tribulation thinking. Lacunza's work would not have had the force it did on Christian theology were it not for Edward Irving, a Presbyterian minister and later a founder of the Catholic Apostolic Church and considered the source of the modern tongues movement, who translated Lacunza's book from Spanish to English and writing a 100-page commentary on it. From reading Lacunza, Irving claimed that Christ would return in 2 phases. The first was a secret rapture prior to the appearance of the Antichrist. The second was his return in power and great glory. Jesuit-born secret rapture theory took a major step forward with the work of John Nelson Darby. Darby is considered to be the father of modern dispensationalism and its related secret rapture theory. There is no conclusive evidence that Darby met or corresponded with Irving, though they were contemporaries and attended prophecy conferences where each other's works were reviewed and critiqued. On the other hand, it seems evident that Darby built his theology on a number of propositions advocated by Irving from Lacunza's work described earlier. Dispensationalism is the idea that history has been deliberately divided by God into distinct periods in which God deals with his people in particular ways. Darby adopted the Jesuit idea of a two-stage return of the Lord, same as Lacunza, the first for the church and the second for Israel. He thought that the Great Tribulation was for the Jews only, so the church would have to be taken out of the picture prior to the tribulation for that to happen. Darby's theology, especially his secret rapture theory, had a lot of proponents and quickly gained ground, especially within the organization called the Plymouth Brethren, which he helped found. Darby visited the United States 6 times between 1859 and 1874 to promote his dispensationalist doctrine. James Inglis, a Scotsman who came to America in 1848, drew strongly on the teachings of Darby and the Plymouth Brethren. After Inglis' death, James Brooks took up the secret rapture reins and organized the Niagara Bible Conferences, which disseminated those ideas further. It was through these conferences that William Blackstone, the father of Christian Zionism, wrote Jesus is Coming in 1878 that became the reference of American dispensational and secret rapture thought over the next 50 years. From there, Dwight L. Moody and C.I. Scofield would hear of and embrace the theory. Dwight L. Moody, an American evangelist and preacher connected with the holiness movement from which Pentecostalism emerged, first heard of dispensationalism through the Plymouth Brethren during a trip to England. Those views were later reinforced by the Niagara Bible Conferences. Moody is known as one of the greatest evangelists of the 19th century. He founded the Moody Bible Institute and Moody Press. It would be through Moody that the secret rapture theory, otherwise known as pre-tribulation rapture, found its way into the Pentecostal community. C.I. Scofield was a contemporary of Blackstone and furthered the popularity of dispensationalism and pre-tribulation rapture through his book Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, and later the Scofield Reference Bible. While Scofield's Correspondence Bible Study served as the basis of his reference Bible, Darby's dispensationalism and pre-tribulation rapture theory permeated throughout. Louis Sperry Schaeffer, a disciple of Scofield's, helped to solidify the belief that the church does not pass through the tribulation because of the parenthetical nature of the church. It is strictly a phenomenon that began at Pentecost and that will end before the consummation of the times of the Gentiles. Thus, the church will not go through the tribulation. Schaeffer would later become the founder of what is today the Dallas Theological Seminary, which had among its students Hal Lindsey, author of The Late Great Planet Earth, which brought the pre-tribulation rapture theory to the masses, with over 35 million copies sold. Millions of these copies, incidentally, were sold long after Lindsey's errors in prophetic predictions were realized.
After 8 years with Campus Crusade for Christ, traveling all over the country and many parts of the world speaking on this subject, I was urged by people to write a book. You know, they would say, give us a book on this subject and we'd like to read more. And so I would recommend the current books and they'd come back and say, will you interpret them for us? We can't understand them. So that's how I got interested in writing.
How many copies has Late Great Planet Earth sold?
It's over 18 million now, and it's in 31 languages.
Mm.
That is, by the way, that is something that is a sign of the times. Only God could do something like that. It's not that it's such a great book or so well written, but it's that the information in it, I believe, is so important and God has blessed it. The New York Times designated that the bestseller of the decade, which, you know, when you take a book on Bible prophecy and God does something like that, that's a sign of the times.
After the release of The Late Great Planet Earth in 1970, pre-tribbers were throwing Second Coming predictions out like they were weather forecasts. But this didn't happen just from the publication of one book. The doctrine had already found its way into evangelical and charismatic communities by means of some Bible colleges and seminaries. These institutions were teaching the doctrine to young men and women who would go on to be leaders and pastors in churches across America. With the Schofield Reference Bible, with its dispensational and rapture-themed study notes in one hand and Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, which legitimized word study as a valid exegetical method, in the other, they took this doctrine into the churches they would lead and pastor. Two institutions of Bible learning stand out as the primary teachers of this theory: Moody Bible Institute and Dallas Theological Seminary. The Moody Press took over Schofield's Bible correspondence course, which strongly promoted dispensationalism and the pre-tribulation rapture theory. Moody Press also supplied Sunday school materials to the newly formed Assemblies of God churches in 1914, and thus introduced Pentecostals to futurism, dispensationalism, and pre-tribulation rapture. Jerry Jenkins, co-author of the Left Behind series, is a graduate of the Moody Bible Institute. Dallas Theological Seminary was founded by Schofield disciple Louis Sperry Schaeffer and has over 15,000 alumni serving around the world. Among its alumni and faculty are well-published authors and well-known pastors and church founders. You'll probably recognize a number of names which represent only a very small fraction of Dallas Theological Seminary's influence in the evangelical world.